This is the oldest recording of a football game in Germany from 1910. It features German footballer Julius Hirsch. He won the first division with Karlsruhe and later made his debut for the national team. Hirsch fought for Germany during World War I, but under Nazi rule he was pushed out of his club, deported and finally murdered in the concentration camp Auschwitz. His patriotism and sporting achievements couldn't save him. Here, in the shadow of Berlin's Olympia Stadium, Julius Hirsch's fate is remembered. An exhibition shows how Adolf Hitler's regime hijacked football for its own benefit.
Football is never neutral. Football was always political, and it still is. Through the exhibition, we show that it's extremely political, that Jewish club members were the first to be excluded from society and had to leave their beloved sports clubs.
Right next to the exhibition, you can see the stadium where the Olympic Games took place in 1936. At first, the Nazis weren't interested in sports at all, but Hitler was impressed by how the Italians had used the 1934 World Cup to showcase fascism. And so Hitler made the Olympic Games his own. Crucially, they were the first ever to be broadcast on television, a perfect stage for the Nazis.
We've had these large stadiums since the 1920s, where 40,000 people can attend matches. They reach an incredible amount of people. Sport played an enormously important role for the Nazis because they could showcase their ideal body image. We're in the right place here. The Olympic Park is full of sculptures.
After seizing power in 1933, Hitler's National Socialist Party began to subject all areas of society to its Nazi ideology. Sport was no longer seen as a hobby, but as a service to the national community, and an arena to train soldiers which would be deployed during World War II.
Workers' sports clubs were banned from 1933 onwards, and then the religious ones, the Protestant and Catholic clubs, were banned from 1935 onwards.
But Jewish athletes had to suffer much worse consequences. The Nazi regime increasingly disenfranchised and humiliated Jews in Germany. Many organizations, including football clubs, declared that they would no longer accept Jews within their ranks. Jewish footballers either switched to Jewish clubs or founded their own.
Jewish officials resigned, but it's not entirely clear whether they were pressured to do so, whether they did it voluntarily or whether they were forced. Clubs always argued that they had to prevent damage. They knew the Nazis were an anti-Semitic regime and that it was better for the club if it wasn't led by a Jew.
Bayern Munich, for example, introduced the so-called Aryan paragraph in 1935. It stated, "It is sufficient for one parent or grandparent to be non-Aryan. Members who may not belong to the club following the principles above shall be considered honorably resigned effective 30th of June 1935. In 1938, Jewish clubs were finally banned completely by the Nazis. Non-Jews, like Heinz Kertz, also suffered under the Nazi regime. His mother was a white German, while his father was a black soldier in the French army. He loved football, but like many other black athletes, he was excluded from sport. In 1937, Kertz was even forcibly sterilized. This was to prevent the so-called Aryan race from mixing with so-called inferior races. 6 years later, he was sent to the Dachau concentration camp. The Nazis also held football matches in their extermination camps. Although it was a privilege available for very few prisoners, Jews were still not allowed to play.
How can death and something like football, which we associate with joy and a certain freedom, exist side by side? In football, they were able to regain some of this freedom of movement. You could celebrate success and score a goal. You could beat an opponent and you weren't always the underdog.
Some prisoners secretly drew football players. This drawing is from the Flossenbürg concentration camp. Football was also used as a propaganda tool. This film was intended to show outsiders that the prisoners weren't really that bad off. The commentator says because of the somewhat limited playing space, the two teams only have 7 players each. Nevertheless, a tough game is played from start to finish with enthusiastic spectators. On the big stage, the Nazis relied on the German national team. Winning was a must, but the plan didn't always work. At the 1934 World Cup in Italy, they finished third. After being eliminated in the quarterfinals at the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, the team also embarrassed itself at the 1938 World Cup in France. Heinz Kertz survived the Dachau concentration camp. He became a football coach and got married. Photos show him in a carnival costume and playing music on stage. But the consequences of forced sterilization and imprisonment were so severe that he had to give up his job as head lifeguard in 1980. Kertz died shortly after his 60th birthday. The Nazi regime has left a lasting legacy on sport, even to this day.
I believe that National Socialism has had a general effect on society that we often don't even see. The torch relay is still carried out at the Olympic Games today, even though it was only introduced in 1936. That may not be so political, but these are things that we may not even notice. Those 12 years changed a lot in society.
The Nazis were not the last to use sport and football for their political purposes. The pretense of normality and fair play, the distraction from grievances and crimes, this is perhaps more common today than ever before. Will sport ever be able to protect itself from manipulation?